So New York City is your hometown.
New York City was my hometown. I grew up in Queens, which is a borough, one of the five boroughs of New York City. I was born and raised there, and lived in Manhattan for a long time. Once I got older, and now I live in Westchester County, which is a suburb of New York City.
Where were you at the time of the first plane crash into the World Trade Center?
Well, I was home that morning. Melissa, my wife, was flying home from a trip, and I was home with the kids. And I had turned on the television in the morning and was watching the news, and that there was a report that a plane had flown into the World Trade Center, and that was when it all started.
Describe the scenario that was going on at that time since your wife, Melissa, was on a plane flying into New York City returning from a friend's house out of town.
When the plane hit and I was watching the news, nobody quite knew what was going on. The first reports were that it was a commuter plane or a private plane that flew in. They didn't know that it was a jet plane, so there was all this commotion and nobody really knew what was going on. And they had a lot of reporters rushing down, and it was just pandemonium. So I was just glued to the television. I didn't know what was going on. Then, after a little while, they realized that it was a jet plane that flew in, and everybody was starting to freak out. A jet plane flew into the World Trade Center. After a little while, then another plane hit the Trade Center, and clearly there was something going on. So people were speculating that there was a terrorist act, but nobody really knew what was happening, other than two jet planes had flown into each of the two World Trade Centers. So as I was watching, more and more news started coming in, and then they said that one of the planes was an American Airlines plane, and Melissa, my wife, was on an American Airlines plane flying back. So of course, immediately I was really scared because I didn't know what was going on. Maybe it was her plane, maybe it was somebody that she knew on the plane. So it was really scary. We sat and watched for a long time, just seeing what was going on as the events started to unfold.
What other connections did you have with the individuals who worked in or near the Twin Towers?
I work in the financial services industry. I work for a bank broker-dealer. And the World Trade Centers housed a lot of other financial services companies, a lot of broker-dealers, a lot of banks. And I had colleagues that were working in the World Trade Centers. I knew somebody that was from my firm that was down there at a conference. So I had a lot of people that I knew that were either in the downtown area, that worked in the downtown area, and or worked in the World Trade Center. So I was very connected to people that worked in that area and in the buildings themselves.
Your sister was very near the Twin Towers that morning. From what she has told you, can you describe what she saw and how it has affected her?
My sister was down in downtown Manhattan that morning at a conference, and when the thing started going crazy, she was in a building and they were looking out the window and seeing what was going on, and she saw people jumping from the World Trade Centers to their deaths because the buildings were burning and fires and the smoke, so people had no way to exit, and they thought they had a better opportunity to just jump. So my sister saw many people, well, I don't know how many people, but she saw a bunch of people jumping from the World Trade Center to their death, and that was obviously a very, very disturbing thing for her to see, and something that has stayed with her to this day. I think that she's had a bit of traumatic stress syndrome because of what she viewed that day, and then leaving downtown Manhattan as the masses of people had to get out as quickly as they could.
How were you initially affected by these events? Did it cause fear or anxiety?
There was fear clearly when it happened, and when Melissa was in the air, and I hadn't heard from her for a few hours, and then finally got a phone call from a friend of hers telling me that she had landed safely. Her plane was diverted to North Carolina, and so I knew that she was safe. But at that point, throughout the day, nobody knew whether that was all that was going on. We knew plane went down to the Pentagon. So there was just so much stuff going on. People didn't know whether this was the beginning, the end, and everybody was scared for a good chunk of time, both whether there were going to be more terrorist attacks, and then for a good chunk of time after the events, not knowing whether you knew people that had died in the buildings or people, relatives that had people that had died in the buildings. So there was a period of time, both right after and then for weeks, where you hadn't heard from people and you didn't want to actually call to say, is so-and-so, was so-and-so in the building? So you would just wait for word to trickle out, and then you would try and contact people and hope that the people that you knew were all safe.
What was your atmosphere, or what was the atmosphere in your city, or in your neighborhood and the surrounding city immediate after the event?
The city was paralyzed. Nobody wanted to go into the city. Everybody was afraid that more things were going to happen. The attitude in various neighborhoods, both here and other neighborhoods that had lost people, was just devastated. The city was devastated. The outer boroughs were devastated. The areas in the suburbs that had lost people were devastated. It was just a horrible time. It was surreal. Nobody could get their arms around the magnitude of what had happened. Sitting and watching two of these tremendous buildings actually crumble with thousands of people.
For you, were there any lasting effects to your personality or the way you view life?
Well, I think that something like that affects you forever. You lose people that you know. You have friends that lost relatives. It's just something that you never thought would happen in the United States or in New York City, and it was just such a shock that it makes everybody realize how vulnerable you are to events that are beyond your control. And I think it makes you realize how sacred life is and how much you need to really live in the moment.
Did it take a while of life in New York City to get back to, quote, normal, or did people prove to be resilient?
People were very resilient. The city really pulled together. It was amazing to watch both the first responders and the folks that got to the buildings and got people out, and also the first responders that lost their lives. But over the course of time, just the rallying effect of the people that lived in the city and lived outside the city, and the outpouring of help from both within the city and from people outside, from people from other states, from other countries. It was an ability. People showed the ability to really deal with a tragedy, but it didn't die that day, and it lasted for a long time. The city was not the same for years, particularly the downtown area.
What were your personal feelings when you visited Ground Zero for the first time after the attacks?
It was really hard to go down there. It was a long time between the time of the attacks and the time that I went down to downtown Manhattan and to the World Trade Center site. I felt like it was something that I didn't want to be down there and gawk at it as if it was some museum. It was just such a difficult place to go back to and to see, knowing what it was like before the attacks and then seeing what it was like after the attacks. And for years afterwards, when I would go downtown, the feeling was completely different, and it still is.
What lasting effects do you see in the city from the tragic events of 9/11?
Well, the downtown area has taken many years to start rebuilding. There were several years where in the immediate area, there was nothing going on. There was just complete devastation, and then over time, they've started doing some rebuilding. They've now put the Freedom Tower up, but there's just a different feel about the place. It's just, I can't really explain it. It's just not the same.